Welcome back to episode 54 of the Hidden History Happy Hour. Alex, can you imagine it's been a month since we recorded an episode?
I'm embarrassed and apologetic to our audience. Sorry about that, guys. We've had a few things going on.
Listen,
I've moved house.
Yes. So I just wanted to make sure we have great fans. They've all been concerned. Nothing wrong with either of us. Thanks to everybody for asking. This basically just summer scheduling snafus. And as you may notice, Alex and I have both recently relocated. Alex and his lovely bride have moved into a new place in London, and I'm spending much of the summer in Fallbrook, California. Now, Alex, since as we record this episode, we're at pretty much the halfway mark until next Christmas, I wanted to note that according to our extensive research team here at the Hidden History Happy Hour, it turns out Fallbrook, California, where I'm sitting right now, was the inspiration for the fictional town of Bedford Falls in a little picture called It's a Wonderful Life.
My mother's favorite film. That's great.
I'm going to put a link to the article, but it's there's the Potter Street. There actually was a James E. Potter who looks almost exactly like the actor that played Potter in the movie. Although I should note, according to my research, the real James E. Potter was a wonderful man, completely unlike the scurvy spider that was the fictional Bedford Falls villain in It's a Wonderful Life.
Good story. I like it.
Yeah. Now,
what are you drinking?
In honor both of today's stories involving France and It's a Summer Afternoon, I'm drinking a very nice rosé. Rosé, of course, having its provenance in the south of France, but not so fast. Rosé actually was consumed at least as far back as the Phoenicians and brought to France by them. Am I right, Alex?
That is correct. And rosé is potentially the first form of wine because of the skin contact. The method is one for which evidence has been found earlier than any other form of wine. And it kind of makes sense because it's a simple way to make wine. I'm not doing rosé down. I think it's tremendous. But it's possible it was the very first form of wine. I, perverse as I am. So I thought of the people we're going to be talking about. I knew they'd be drinking white wine, Chardonnay, the king of white grapes. Anyone who says anything but Chardonnay it doesn't know what they're talking about. People say, "Oh no, I won't have any Chardonnay." Then you say, "Well, would you like some Chablis?" And they say, "Oh yes, that'd be lovely." Chablis, of course, being Chardonnay. So I'm having Chardonnay, but because of my perversity, I'm having Argentine Chardonnay today, not French. And the back of this bottle of Chardonnay called El Enemigo, which is a great name, which you'll understand in a second, says this: "At the end of the journey, we remember only one battle, the one we fought against ourselves, the original enemy, the one that defined us." Enemigo. What a great name, huh?
Yeah. Well, my rosé is from one of my favorite Willamette Valley vineyards, and it's an estate rosé made from the Pinot Noir grape. And I do not love Pinot Noir, but I love Pinot Noir rosé. So
I also love Pinot Noir champagne. So
yes, that's good. Yeah.
I don't much care for red Pinot.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too.
Yeah.
So listen, fans, our first story today is timely indeed, as it involves an uprising. And as we record this on June 26, 2023, we're all digesting the aftermath of the brief, but one hopes consequential PMC Wagner military mutiny or coup or whatever you want to call it in Russia over the weekend, to which I can only say Slava Ukraini. It's hard to see how this can be anything but a net negative for Putin, and it should be boosting the morale of our friends in Ukraine. What do you think, Alex?
I agree with that, but beyond that, it's very hard to speculate as to what on earth it means. I mean, plainly, the Wagner Group have at least a portion of it, including its most senior leadership, has turned against their Kremlin masters, and that's to be welcomed. But of course, if the answer to something is more power to a group of mercenaries recruited from prisons, you're probably asking the wrong question. So I didn't know who I wanted to lose more in that fight, especially when it came to control of a nuclear-armed state. But this so-called rebellion seems to have dissolved incredibly quickly. It flared in a matter of days to marching on Moscow to out of it and abandoned, to a security promise made for the head of the Wagner Group being effectively, as far as I can see from Putin now, abandoned. I mean, you've got to be a special kind of idiot to trust anything Putin says these days. The promise of your own security is not worth the paper it was written on.
I would definitely have a food taster if I were Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Well, it's a
But
matter of the half-life on the time before he accidentally falls out of a high window is eroding fast, I fear.
yeah, I think I mean, he's not a person I
He's a
necessarily
bad
want on
guy,
the
right?
earth, but
Yeah.
yeah, but after all, I mean, the guy is a mercenary, and if he got paid, and if he thinks he can live to, fight or not fight another day, I guess he survived the day, which is amazing. And I have to say, there's a little bit of the intelligence officer in me that almost has to wonder if this is not an incredibly Putin-esque, KGB-inspired way to test who was loyal to Putin and who wasn't, and it was all a propaganda play.
Oh,
But
to test the
I
loyalists in the
can't think that
Kremlin.
with the 12. I can't think that with the 12 dead Russian helicopter pilots. I don't think that would have been part of the plan.
Well, plus you've got to bear in mind the huge amount of armor and materiel that was taken away from vital front line. It's
Yeah,
very hard to think of it as some kind of deliberate ploy. You see the occasional conspiracy theory online that they're performing a
yeah,
massive boomerang to come round through Belarus and into Ukraine. People
yeah.
haven't and into Kiev, but they really haven't thought about the time that would take, the ramification, which is just not happening anyway. So that's for the birds. But the guy personally is in Belarus, it seems. And I would tell you, he's no safer there than he would be in Russia itself.
Yeah, not unless he's somehow got enough money to pay off Putin's crony
There isn't enough money in
not
the
turn
world.
against Putin, but not help. No, I think you're right about that. I think he's a dead man walking. I do think that it's nothing but good news for the Ukrainians, as long as it doesn't push Putin over into desperation, which one would think if it were going to do that, it already would have by now. But imagine the unit cohesion and the morale in these units of Wagner fighters who have decided to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry instead of being executed. And imagine being in the trenches if you're a regular Russian soldier with these Wagner guys.
Yeah. Forgive you. You don't know if they're going to pull a bullet in the back of your head or if you want to put a bullet in the back of theirs. I mean,
Right.
even before you get to that kind of, I mean, they're like the death's head commandos, the suicide battalions the Germans had towards the end of the war. I would imagine if they weren't already. But even before that, imagine what it must have been like serving in these units. We're fighting the Ukrainian Nazis, what they were told. Now we're about turning and we're marching on Moscow. Now we're going back again. That's in the
Yeah.
space of like 4 days.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think the most troubling thing for Putin has to be the way they were apparently received in Rostov. I mean, imagine Rostov was the headquarters for the Russian military operations in Ukraine. And at least
Right.
based on the video I saw, these guys were welcomed as friends.
Well, I got to tell you though, if an army marches into your town, the smart thing to do is to wave a flag and say welcome. And then when the next army marches in next week, it's fantastic, great to see you. So I wouldn't read too much into that one, but I see your point, of course.
That's true. I don't know whether the person on the street opinion is as valuable, but presumably Rostov being the center of military operations for Ukraine, they had some weapons, and there probably were regular Russian soldiers that could have defended that town if they wanted
There
to.
was at least one regular unit that was reported to have joined the Wagner group rather than oppose it. It was an airborne army unit equivalent.
Yeah.
I'm not getting the terminology quite right, but that was reported. And to your point, their disloyalty has been flushed out. But of course, some of these people will rightly think to themselves, well, what am I loyal to? Am I loyal to Russia? Am I loyal to Vladimir Putin?
Yeah.
Are those two things separated? And that is where Putin's invincibility suddenly pierced, because it's put in ways that even his control of the media can't take away from things. The notion that his interests are not indivisible from the interests of the state.
Yeah. And that there's alternatives too, which is what he's tried very hard to create over the last 2 decades was not true, that there were no good alternatives to him. And I'm not saying in reality Prigozhin's a good alternative, but the idea that somebody could, capture a town and bring tanks within 150 miles of Moscow, that's given some people some second thoughts. But let's circle back to our original uprising that we wanted to talk about. I will say, I do think, and I think our show has got a very good track record of predicting things happening in Ukraine. I do think that one way or the other, as we both agree, Prigozhin's days are certainly numbered. but I think we might have seen the beginning of the end of Putin, at least as an absolute dictator as well.
I certainly hope so. And the story I'm going to tell has some resonances with that. This is the 20th story from the first book of Dean History, called The Day of the Tiles. And we've all, you and I included, Bryan, together several times, had an occasional night on the tiles. But the Day of the Tiles is quite different, and depending on how you spend your nights, I suppose, rather more painful. The ancient city of Grenoble, which is why you've chosen your wine, was the capital of the old French region of Dauphiny in the southeast. Possession of the region by French royalty came with the condition that the heir to the throne be called Dauphin after it. And there's a parallel, Bryan, in my country with Prince of Wales. The Principality has, as part of being our country, the heir to the throne in my country is named Prince of Wales, or one day perhaps Princess of Wales. Anyway, Louis the 16th did not have a good run of things, what with being the only French monarch to be executed and presiding over the end of 1,000 years of royal rule and so forth. But he could hardly have appreciated that things would kick off in the southeastern corner of the realm at Grenoble. The town people were impoverished by France's ongoing financial crisis. Harvests were bad, bread was expensive, that's very bad for the state. And the first, clerical, and second, aristocratic estates indicated zero willingness to give up their privileges. So the third estate, the peasants and bourgeois, looked to take things into their own hands. As so often with new movements, they sought to ground their demands in the heritage of an older tradition so as to lend them and their arguments credibility and authority. Thus, the old estates of the province of Dauphiny would serve as the pretext for their gathering of a proto-republican movement. Locked in a headlong death spiral of absolutism and short-sighted self-interest, both the crown and the nobles and clergymen in orbit around it refused to yield an inch on anything. Nowadays, in my country and perhaps in yours, they'd have been spinning the fact that we were in listening mode and had a judge-led inquiry with 6 modules that would report back in a few years,
Right.
and they might well have survived. So it was, given their unwillingness to move, that the crown sent troops to quell this movement. We've discussed this before in the podcast. There are good reasons not to put troops on the streets at times of concern about law and order. Not only because there is a distinction between the civilian populace policing itself and the army imposing law on it, that's between civil and martial law, but also there is the fact that once the army is deployed, the army does what it does. Armies are for fighting. Thus it was that as the elite regiments of the Royal Navy sought to suppress protesters, the sight of them bayoneting an old man in the street spurred the crowds in Grenoble to fury. Small groups of troops, outnumbered by the mass of revolting citizens of Grenoble, opened fire into the crowds. And the rioters dispersed and took to the roofs of the buildings around them. And on the streets down which the soldiers were seeking to quell dissent, a rain of roof tiles from all sides soon assailed the forces of the crown. Hence, Day of the Tiles. And Bryan, such circumstances are all but impossible for law enforcement. The mob, out of control, cannot be reasoned with. It's made up of their fellow Frenchmen, whose demands they may well very well may share on another occasion. So the troops gradually yielded control of much of the town, but not the arsenal. Never the arsenal. And
well, except for in Seattle in the summer of 2020.
Yeah, we told me about that, and I was aghast. But on this occasion, they stuck at least to this rule. The judges who were due to attend the meeting of the estates were pressed back to the palace by a crowd carrying flowers and singing the praises of Parliament. And the army, realizing that it was onto a loser, gave permission for the estates to meet as long as it took place outside the city. And that is a compromise that was canny and astute, albeit having looked at the history books, I must say that the authority possessed to offer that permission or concession is rather elusive. Anyway, these events therefore constitute both the first violent outbreak in what became the French Revolution and its first public meetings, which saw demands both for a national parliament and an end to absolute monarchy. And that is a movement that changed the whole of Europe. So I say it's worth knowing about the Day of the Tiles.
I agree, and I'm very glad that you and I have tiled one on together.
Spot on. Let me give you a couple of postscripts. First, it is you and I have discussed this before. It's amazing how much people preferred not to blame the monarchy, instead holding bad servants of the crown responsible. This happens in your country all the time. It wasn't the president, it was the advisors.
Yeah.
It happens in my country all the time. It wasn't the king or queen, it wasn't the prime minister, it was those around them. As they conducted their protests, the citizens of Grenoble sang praises to the king. So even at that point, Louis could have rescued things with a different approach. Second, final postscript. When you're in a coup in the modern age, as we saw all the way through Africa and South America, as the 20th century saw all its coups, the key is to seize the airport and seize the radio station. In a French anti-monarchic protest, what you do is seize the cathedral. As the crowds rang the great bells of the cathedral in a symbol for the peasantry around Grenoble to come to their aid and join in the riot. And I thought the symbolism of those sacred bells ringing out for that to be quite potent.
Yeah, and probably not preordained, right? I mean, that's not pre-agreed. There was no document that says, hey, when you hear these bells, ride to the
it's
sound
all kicking off. No,
Yeah.
it was instead the that's not the right time for Vespers. Right, game on.
Well, and of course your point about not taking on the monarchy is ringing true today, literally today in Russia. Prigozhin is trying to save his own life by saying, oh, no, I didn't mean Vladimir Putin. I meant those generals that are ill-advising him and giving him bad information and is filling his head full of lies. So even now that narrative continues, although in this case, maybe it's more self-serving than patriotic in anyone's view.
Right. It's but of course, the other reason he would say that, even if he was still carrying on, is that he's more likely to secure, in a culture which has been told Vladimir Putin is, a philosopher king by all of their media for the last 2 decades. You're much more likely to realize success by saying, the problem here is the head of the army and the chief of staff, which was his argument. It's not, of course, it's not Vladimir Putin, or at least not directly. He didn't say that.
Also a better way to stay alive, too.
Well, as it turns out, yeah.
Although I still don't think it'll work. So is there evidence of sort of how lethal it was to have tiles? Let me put it like this. Was the army actually in fear of their safety, or was it just more, oh, this is serious, we better start talking?
Of course, Grenoble is like a lot. We could learn a lot from our wise forefathers. Gentle density is a good thing. 4 or 5 story townhouses are very attractive, highly sought after in cities across Europe, and as their number of stories implies, tall. So throwing tiles, but not just 1 or 2 either, at somebody from their roof can have serious deleterious effect. I'm not saying they killed dozens, but they certainly injured a lot of people. There will have been inevitably have been a few casualties. But these troops must have been terrified as well, because it was like the houses were falling apart on top of them. So it's a really vivid image as you think about it. The entirety of the roof tiles of every house around you suddenly belting down with precision. It's not just falling; it's aimed at you. Must have been absolutely terrifying.
And there's a famous painting, I think, about the Day of the Tiles. It was painted about 100 years later, right?
And no illustrations in my book, apart from obviously the cover. But and I tended not to do threads when I tell the stories online of pictures. I did a couple when it really was demanded, it really was necessary. But I like to stick with the purity of prose. But you're right, there's a great picture of the Day of the Tiles.
Well, any of our fans that would rather see an artist's imagining of it than their own imagining of it can look it up. We won't put it in the show notes, so to stay pure to the Alex Dean brand, but you can find it with an easy Google, my friends, I promise you. So our other story today, also about France.
And
if I'm not mistaken.
It's correct. And this is the latest story that I have told on Twitter. So it's not in either of the books. You're hearing it here before it's in publication. And this is this is the 203rd Dean history I've told online. There are plenty of stories too in the books that are not online. But I would say this, Bryan, I think this is the story I've told that has the most pure kind of, there is a lesson to this story that I've told of any of them. And it's a shorter story, and it goes like this. Everyone knows that at Waterloo, Napoleon did surrender. Oh, my. Actually, he did not, as you know, but he fled and abdicated, having lost at Waterloo. So the pub quiz question is, what was Napoleon's last victory? And if you're listening or watching, I suggest you might want to pause for a moment and see if you can answer. And for those of you who got it right, well done. For those of you who just wanted to enjoy listening, the answer is the Battle of Ligny. Ligny, pronounced Ligny, which was fought 2 days before Waterloo. And I say there is a reason that that information is useful, apart from perhaps winning you a point in a pub quiz. And it is this. Emperor Napoleon's strategy in his 100 days in command after he'd been restored to power was to try to fight the allies across Europe who opposed him separately. Since massed together, they would constitute too strong a force, even for the French army, which was a tremendous force in that day. And at Ligny, in a bloody battle, he caught a good portion of the Prussian army and achieved great success against them. And as I told the story as an illustration of Prussian travails, I noted by way of illustration of the Prussians getting caught up at Ligny, that Blücher himself, who was 72 years old at the time, was in personal command of forces in the field. He'd been frustrated by how the battle was going, and he took personal command of a bit of the action, and he had a horse killed from under him, and they fell. The horse fell on top of Blücher. He could well have died, but he didn't. He emerged slightly injured. Anyway, at the time, Prussia's tactical defeat at Ligny, bloody tactical defeat, was likely seen as another sign of Napoleon's phenomenal success. And no doubt, for 48 hours, that's what Napoleon thought. But the result at Ligny was decided in large part because the Prussians decided to withdraw, marshalling their forces and retreating in good order. And they did so not in the most natural line of escape, which was to the east. They did so to the north, towards Wellington's army, the British army, which was fast approaching. There is all the difference in the world. This is the point. There's all the difference in the world between an orderly retreat and a rout. And on this occasion, still functioning as a fighting army as a result of their retreat, reinforced with fresh troops by the time the next battle came, and now united with their British and other allies. Famously, the Prussians were able to play a vital part in Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo 2 days later. The ability of the Prussians to pull back in an organized fashion once their forces had been committed on the battlefield is not the stuff of oft-told heroic tales, but it is worth dwelling on, I think. Because the thing is to be able, as the grape shot whizzes by and your colleagues panic on the one hand and demand more belligerence on the other, to be able accurately to assess, is this the vital battle at which all must be committed? Or is it the precursor to the decisive one for which we should save our strength? And there is a reason that winning the battle and not the war is an expression. Ask yourself this. What do you associate with Napoleon when you hear his name? Is it his final victory at Ligny or his final defeat at Waterloo? And in light of your answer to that, now assess the Prussian retreat from the battlefield at Ligny.
Yeah.
Good one. Huh?
Well, yeah, very good. And hot off the presses, as they say, too.
Oh.
You can only find it here and on Alex's Twitter space. How would you compare this to, an unfair question I didn't prepare you for, but how would you compare this to Dunkirk? Obviously Dunkirk is known in history for saving the British Army, but it wasn't exactly an orderly retreat,
heavens,
right?
No, the Prussians acquitted themselves admirably at Ligny. And what part of what I'm admiring is the willingness to maintain themselves as a fighting force and in an orderly fashion retreat. The British did not retreat in an orderly fashion towards the Dunkirk pocket. And it was a miracle that Dunkirk came off, not least because of the incredible willingness of every little boat owner in the south coast and well beyond, boats from Scotland.
Yeah.
People from all over my country just took their boats, said, right, sod it, let's go. And they went to the beach and hauled guys off the beach of Dunkirk. The loss of materiel at Dunkirk was incredible. We lost almost all our tanks. The British Expeditionary Force was shattered. We lost huge numbers of men, prisoners of war. And if the Germans had pushed on rather than having this very weird pause about which historians negotiate. And so historians argue to this day. There was an argument about not letting one unit overtake another. There was an argument about whether the right thing was to pause and let the Luftwaffe finish the job, which plainly it couldn't do on its own. If the Germans had forced their advantage, the effect on the British army would have been shattering. The point about Ligny is that it was the Prussian will that ensured their orderly retreat, not a big mistake by their opponents, which, with all great credit to the heroes of Dunkirk, was what happened. It was the German mistake that allowed the large portion of the men to come off the beaches rather than British tactical brilliance.
Well, and I think your point is reinforced about the Prussians by thinking about, two forces that were operating on them at the same time at the individual level. And I'm sure, like in every army, a lot of these people are conscripts and young or very old. The idea of doing anything in an orderly way when you're getting shot at is a problem. And then the martial culture, especially of the Prussians, to be able to say, instead of I'm going to fight to the death for the fatherland, to say I'm going to back away and live to fight another day, that probably went against a lot of the ego of the commanders.
It absolutely did. And that's part of, I suppose, why I admire what they did and how they pulled it off. And had they done if they were just determined to flee and then break their units down, that would have been terrible. Had they done the easiest thing for them as a fighting unit and withdrawn to the east, they would have found it more difficult to unite with Wellington's forces in time to play the influential role they did at Waterloo. So everything about what they undertook there is to be, I think, admired. But there's a lesson there for corporate life. There's a lesson there for sports. There's a lesson there for arguments you have in your own life. Is this the ultimate battle? Yeah. Is this where every resource should be committed?
Is it the hill you want to die on?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And actually, this a little bit kind of brings me back to something I was thinking about over the weekend with what happened in Russia. I don't know if it was on your Twitter feed or one of your countrymen's Twitter feed, but they put up photographs of these sort of like rusting, decayed, falling off the cliffs defense sites in Scotland from World War II. And, the joke was, if the Russians come our way, we'll just reactivate these sites, meaning obviously they had not been maintained. And you have to wonder if, in our case, all of a sudden some crazy general in the Canadian military assembled 20,000 people and rolled them across Vermont, probably that person would get pretty far before we organize their annihilation. And same thing for you guys.
I didn't see the threads that you were mentioning, but I must say I know the phenomenon you're talking about. If one takes the train north of Edinburgh, north of Glasgow, if you go up towards Dundee, you go through Kirkcaldy and so forth, you imagine how far the Germans would have had to, assuming they invaded from the south of England, as seemed to be their plan. But you have to imagine how far the Germans would have come. The faith and belief that we would still be fighting on is demonstrated by the gun posts, the little pillboxes, the machine gun posts that are dug into the landscape. And they absolutely thought we would still be fighting once the Germans had fought north of Edinburgh.
Yeah. Well, and also was also to defend against a sea invasion from the north too, right?
But the most likely outcome was, of course, to fight their way up the country. Most plans to invade this country will always begin with capture London.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm sort of getting at is, we've said this many times since COVID and January 6th and other crazy shit that's happened, which is, I'm now operating under the principle of just because something is unbelievable doesn't mean it's not possible. And that's, this guy rolled tanks, as we said, into Rostov and took the town. And I wonder how many of our countries would, with no warning, be able to defend against that. Now, of course, we hopefully come back and ultimately win, but everybody might be more vulnerable than we think. And if I was Poland, I'd be thinking about that.
Yes. Moldova. Extraordinary.
Lithuania. Yeah. Well, these are two great lessons at the right time, which is what we try to accomplish around here. I do have, before we sign off, I do have a request for our wonderful fans, and that is we've just grown so much over these 54 episodes, and we switched to video after episode 15, And we have this growing group of listeners and viewers. But I would ask this: if you found us back in the pre-video days, and or you follow us mostly on Spotify or another podcast channel, please just take a minute, subscribe to us on YouTube and Twitter. Even if you don't watch on YouTube, it's helpful to us, and vice versa. If you only know us from YouTube or from Twitter, go on Spotify or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts and give us a good review, because believe me, it all helps keep the show going.
It really helps us out. Spot on.
And thank you, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Speak soon.
See you next time.
Cheers.